Welcome to Houses versus Apartments from the Resident Perspective, a webinar first in a series of webinars hosted by HomeViews. I'm going to be your host today. My name's Rory Cramer. I'm CEO and co-founder of HomeViews. I'm joined by a glittering expert panel, and they really need no introduction, just if you haven't met or come across them in your professional careers, we have Grania Gilmore and Rob Owens from Zoopla. I don't think I need to introduce Zoopla, only if you've been hiding under a rock for a while, but Zoopla is the UK's most comprehensive property destination on a mission to reimagine intelligent home decisions for everyone. And Grania is head of research at Zoopla, leading a market-leading team. Grania was also, previous to that, head of UK residential research at Knight Frank for 8 years. Before this, she was an economics and business finance journalist at the Times. Welcome, Grania. Rob Owens is senior property analyst at Zoopla, specialising in the new homes analytics, and will be providing some great insights for us today. Welcome, Chris Jones, managing director of Space and Time. Space and Time is the UK's leading digital marketing agency, working with ambitious brands to grow market share, interpret and act on opportunities in the marketing landscape, and ultimately realise the potential in their business. So a brilliant expert panel. Thank you so much for joining. The agenda today, I'll be providing an overview of a white paper that we're publishing tomorrow, which looks at the resident experience in build-to-sell housing developments versus apartment developments. It's the first piece of research of its kind. Within that, I'll actually be announcing the current top 10 rated housing developments and apartment developments in the UK. After that, Zoopla, Grania and Rob will be providing a detailed market update on pricing and demand. And then Chris will be providing an insight into consumer behaviour and what people are searching for. So a packed agenda. Please do send any questions that you have. We'll do our best to answer them. We've got some amazing insights to get through, but we do want to do a Q&A at the end of this. So without further ado, I will just share my screen. So, houses versus apartments from the resident perspective. Now, I think I need to introduce HomeViews for those of you that don't know us before, so you understand why we're in a position to conduct this piece of research. As I said, I'm CEO and co-founder of HomeViews. We launched in February 2019. Our mission statement is very clear. We aim to share useful and trustworthy insights about residential developments to support those looking for their new home. We believe that the biggest financial decision of your life is your home, whether you're renting or buying, and frankly, there wasn't any transparency and good quality insights for the consumer on where they should live and also the type of housing available to them. We are purely focused on new build developments, and we focus on developments built since the year 2000 of over 50 units. We are the largest data set of verified resident reviews. We initially focused in London. We then moved to most major cities in the UK, and we now cover the whole of the UK and the regions as well, hence our ability to compare housing and apartments today. We have over 25,000 reviews on HomeViews now. We cover over 1,300 residential developments, which total about 180,000 homes. And we're very different from any other review site. And one of the big things for us, and there's a huge amount in the press about fake news, fake reviews. When you write a review on HomeViews, we take your full name, postcode, and flat number, and we check the electoral roll, credit card contracts, and mobile phone contracts. So when you read a verified review, you know that person lives in the building. It's very important as a prospective resident to know you're reading truthful insights, but it's also very important to verify it from the industry's perspective. One resident writes one review. It's not an open forum. And I think this is incredibly important because to provide a real context on what it's like to live in the building, often a vocal minority that isn't having a great time can blow their experience out of proportion. They're absolutely allowed to write a review on HomeViews, but not multiple. The reviews are by development and not by brand. This seems really obvious in terms of if you're looking for a new home, you want to know about the building, but on other review sites, you'll actually be reviewing the brand instead. So this provides real detailed insight into the prospective place you want to live. We collect over 18 different data points. We'll show you some of those data points in the presentation today. That does three things. It avoids issue-led reviews. You know, I've had no hot water for a week, 1 star. We ask about the facilities, the design, the location, the value, the management. Please name one thing or more you wish you'd known before you'd moved in. We get to the nub of the experience of what it's like to live in a building. And that also allows us to provide insights back to the industry like we're doing today. And lastly, we proactively source reviews. And I think the big point of this is that the people most likely to write reviews are someone with a problem. And that's fine. But if you're providing a real insight, you need to capture benignly happy people that are having a fine time as well. So that's why we proactively go and source reviews. And it also means that we can provide this level of insight right across the market. And we're working right across the residential industry. So this is a selection of some of our partners, but I think just important to illustrate that we cover build to rent, build to sell, and housing associations. And we take reviews from private tenants, owners, shared owners, and housing association tenants. And we define those reviewer types as well. So that allows us to really get into granular level insights. That's enough about us. On to the point at hand, houses versus apartments. So this data sample is based on 8,653 verified reviews by owners and tenants. It covers 900 new build to sell developments. So we're focusing on the build to sell experience. 700 of those are apartment led developments and 196 of those are housing developments. And the overall picture is incredibly positive for both houses and apartments. Not something you may think if you were to read, you know, a lot of the headlines in the press that obviously associated with the new build industry. However, apartments do just pip houses to the post, and the biggest difference in our star rating. So when a reviewer writes a review on HomeViews, they give an overall rating: facilities, design, location, value, and management. The biggest differences in scores are actually in facilities. Apartments are rated higher, which you may expect because a lot of apartment buildings do have more facilities. However, housing residents recognise facilities as maybe communal play areas, community centres, the landscape gardens within their development. And the other biggest point of difference is in management. Now, residential management is one of the lowest scores throughout at HomeViews, and there is a bigger differential there. Apartments scoring 11% higher than houses, and overall apartments are actually 5% higher in the overall star rating. So that's the general picture. I wouldn't say there's, you know, a huge headlines there, but most importantly, overall a positive story. Now, I'm just about to show you the top 10 housing developments and the top 10 apartment developments. Before I do, one of the things we love to do at HomeViews is to learn from what the residents are saying. And I think looking at the common themes of the top rated developments is fascinating because it really shows, you know, what people are appreciating in their home. And for houses, access to open green space and areas of wildlife, it comes through in nearly every single one of the top 10 developments, particularly in the top 3. Rooms being well designed with limited space, probably also a product of people being in their home a lot over the last 18 months and really appreciating a well-designed space for parking, and also snagging and customer service has a huge impact on how you feel about your home. It has a lingering impact, and snagging issues dealt with quickly really make you feel looked after, and that's really all about communication. When it comes to apartments, friendly, responsive management teams. Obviously, a lot of apartment developments may have on-site teams. They can have such a huge impact on the experience of the resident. An informative buying process. Often apartments may be sold a little further off plan, so making sure that is informative and you are holding their hand. And first-time buyers really appreciate that extra help in the sales process. And in fact, our #1 rated apartment block is mainly first-time buyers, and they just feel supported along the whole way. Great locations on top of transport nodes, as you would expect, the top-rated apartments, and a homely community feel. Now, that's easier said than done. That's also usually driven by the management team proactively curating a community. So there's some of the learnings from the top 10 houses and apartment developments. Now, onto the lists. The top 10 highest rated housing developments in the UK. You have the Boulevards, you have the Boulevards by Linden Homes, Bryson Park by Redrow at 10 and 9, number 8 Burstead Park by Berkeley Homes, Crest Nicholson at Halton and Highbrook Park by Crest Nicholson, joint 5th with Wilson Chase, Grosvenor Park by Taylor Wimpey in 4th, and Sheavesby Park in 3rd position by Bellway Homes, Brooklands Park by Barrett and David Wilson Homes, and Davidson Homes #1, Davidson Homes at Halton, an amazing result. And what came through, and in fact you can see from the picture of Davidson Homes, the access to nature, the access to wildlife, and that feeling of open green space. Residents also love the design of the buildings, the build quality. Sheavesby Park by Bellway, much the same. I mean, you can see here both of those top 3 the photos indicate that space as well, that and you will see in some of the lowest rated developments, the feedback is it's too dense, and I think a lot of these schemes really delivered that space and sense of space. So congratulations to everyone on this. This is ever changing, this is live data as of now, but congratulations to everyone. And apartments, we have #2 Upper Riverside, Greenwich Peninsula by Night Dragon, Greenland Place by Barrett Homes, Kidbrooke Village by Berkeley Homes, Park Central by Crest Nicholson, Stanmore Place by St Edward, London City Island and Wardian London, a joint 4th, both by EcoWorld Ballymore, joint venture, and joint 2nd for Wembley Park Gate and One the Regent by Barrett Homes and Renica. And #1 is Deptford Foundry by Anthology. Deptford Foundry has really been a stalwart in our ratings at #1 since we started HomeViews. The feedback's been consistently great, and it's from a lot of first-time buyers that feel supported by the team there, but also really appreciate the design, appreciate the placemaking. I think it's great to see as well, if you see in both the top 10s, they're from all over the country. Slightly more apartment buildings, obviously, in London, but again, Park Central in Birmingham, One the Regent in Manchester. And in fact, our build-to-rent research shows a lot of the top-rated build-to-rent buildings are all out of London, but it's great to see that geographical coverage. Well done to everyone in the top 10 places. As I said, this is a moving feast. This is data taken at a certain point in time. It's based on a minimum of 20 verified reviews to qualify for this. Now, it's great to know what the best developments are and why they are the best developments. So we also think it's incredibly important to learn from the not so highly rated schemes. So while we're not going to throw anyone under the bus on specific developments, we do always look for insights that we can learn from the lowest rated and from the worst resident experiences. And there are some very common themes here across houses and apartments. Customer service and management are the 2 most common. So in houses, poor customer service, particularly regarding after-sales care. Reviewers feel that they were overpromised in the sales process. High management fees. I read quite a few reviews saying they don't understand, particularly in housing developments, where the management fee is going. Is it particularly when maybe the landscaped areas aren't being kept up well, and that perception of not getting great value, and really interestingly, that houses being built too close together. That feeling of density really imposing on your experience. Maybe when you move into a home, you're expecting to have that sense of space. So some great takeaways from there. And in the apartments lowest rated developments, some common themes were slow responses to snagging issues, unhelpful management on site, And this is really interesting and very relevant for right now. I think it's 27 degrees outside. Apartments getting too hot. Now, even when it's not 27 degrees, we actually did a piece of research with Knight Frank last year. It's just been quoted in the Times a couple of weeks ago. This is a really common issue amongst new build developments, new build apartments, particularly where there isn't any comfort cooling or air conditioning. And as a result of apartments getting too hot, I mean, there's a flip side to that, is they stay warm in the winter. But you maybe don't appreciate that as much as when you can't sleep or be comfortable in your own flat. But then to open the windows and have noise issues, either by proximity to other apartments, it's a real thing, and something that I think the industry is aware of and needs to address. And there was also a feeling that residents had been oversold in some apartment schemes. So that's the insights from a report that will be published tomorrow, that you will get a link to, that has a lot more detail in it. This is just a summary. And one last thing to leave you with, I won't go into this in too much detail, but when we drill down purely into owners that have bought directly from the developer, we actually ask another set of questions that we don't publish publicly on HomeViews. We ask those reviewers to rate the customer service, the delivery timetable, the quality and after sales care. And that allows us to create benchmarks of what good looks like. And we can do that at a UK level, at a regional level. For house builders, we can also provide that insight in terms of comparing development to development. And we go into this analysis in a lot of detail in the report tomorrow. Just a quick takeout: shared owners tended to receive give much lower scores than owners in general in the after sales care and customer service element. So I think there's some real learnings to take away from those insights that we go into more detail on in the main report. That is enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Gronya and Rob to give us a market update.
Thank you very much indeed. And Ash is very kindly going to drive the slides for us. Thank you, Ash. So over the next 10 minutes or so, we want to give you an insight into some of the market trends we're seeing in the housing market more generally. And then Rob is going to take you through in more detail what we're seeing in the new homes market. So to kick us off, Ash, onto the first slide, please. Thank you. Here is what is going on with house prices just at the moment. We're seeing house price growth of around 4.7%, but we can see that there is upward momentum happening with house prices across the UK. Wales leading from the front, the Midlands, the North showing strong growth, and perhaps London trailing as it has been for 6 or 7 months. On to the next slide, please, Ash. What we're really seeing is it's the more affordable markets. So if you look at the pink writing at the bottom of this slide, it's where household income is needed to buy, where it's more modest. So you've got in Wales, Yorkshire and the Humberside, North East, East Midlands, average household income needed to buy a property in those areas under £37,000. Move up, as we all know, South East in London, where capital values are higher, you need a higher household income. There's less headroom for house price growth, even with all the pandemic trends we're seeing in the market, which I'll get into a little bit more detail on the next slide. So really the big theme is in the more affordable markets, there's been more headroom for growth, and that is where we are seeing house price growth approaching 10-year highs in some parts of the country. More modest levels of growth in those markets where you already have higher capital values. On to the next slide, please. Looking at London in a bit more detail, I mentioned that it was trailing the rest of the country by quite some margin, growth around 2.2% compared to that 7% that we saw in Wales. But again, quite a localised market within London, as we all know. In those outer London boroughs, we are still seeing levels of growth 4% plus, because the search for space that we're seeing during the pandemic, a lot of home movers looking for additional space, and that can come in a house, especially a house with outside space with a garden. A lot of that stock is based in these outer boroughs of London. So that's feeding into some of the price trends we're seeing, especially after the pandemic. In contrast, in inner London, perhaps in those more flat heavy markets, and we're just producing data, and you'll see it on the next slide as well, where we're looking at demand for houses and flats. Demand for flats still up compared to where we were in the average of the whole of 2020, but demand for houses is way outstripping it. Again, that search for space coming to the fore. And that is having a bit of an impact in inner London, again, where you have clusters of flats where price growth is just flatlining or perhaps just dipping year on year compared to some strong price rises for houses. On to the next slide, please, Ash. So here we have the whole market summed up. Total demand for housing in the year to date so far this year is currently running 25% ahead of the average that we saw in 2020. But the reason that we're getting this upward pressure on pricing is that the listing of homes for sale is not keeping pace. The total stock available, that's the total homes available to buy, is down 25% year on year. The flow of new supply, if you like, the water coming into the swimming pool has got back up to where we would expect this time of year. It's just 2% below, but it's not enough to replenish that total housing stock. It's been eroded by the sheer levels of activity that we've seen over the last 8-9 months. So that is putting upward pressure on prices, and we do think that that's got further to run as we move through the rest of the year. On to the next slide, please, Ash. So this is when I talk about total demand levels. And you can see here, we put the 2019 levels in so you can compare what we're seeing in the market compared to more normal market conditions pre-pandemic. We had a massive spike at the beginning of 2020 that you'll all remember. We had the Brexit vote, we had the general election. We knew what was going to happen. The market took off. So if you just looked at the last 4 months and you saw demand was falling, you might think, oh, what's happening? In fact, it had just reached such record highs that even though it's fallen at that end of the chart, we are still operating 50-60% above where we would have been in more normal market conditions compared to 2019. On to the next slide, please, Ash. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the search for space that we're still seeing playing out. That demand is filtering through more strongly into house prices for houses over flats. And you can see how this is broken down across the country. This is for semi-detached homes and then for flats. And this is May. We've just done a June update, so keep your eyes peeled next week where we'll be issuing an update on this chart. But you can see that some pricing for flats year on year holding their own, but maybe just down less than 1%, whereas house prices for houses very much upwards. And that's going to have an impact when you're coming to sell, what your kind of expectations are around pricing as a result of the pandemic. On to the next slide, please, Ash. So we can see the search for space, older homeowners making lifestyle changes, and real activity among first-time buyers is driving that demand. We do expect a busier year this year than any time since 2007 with 1.5 million sales. That's up from 1 million last year. More challenging economic landscape. Will the COVID opening up remain? So we've got a bit of a more challenging landscape as we move through the second half of the year, but we do expect average prices to remain positive in kind of low single digit, but definitely in positive territory at the end of this year. And now I'm going to hand over to Rob to look at the new homes market in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Grania. So yeah, next slide, please, Ash. And yeah, so this is just going to be a run through of new homes. So think of it as demand 4 ways. So we're going to focus on demand and Zoopla's listings as well. So next slide, please. And this is the counterpart of the slide that Grania shared a couple of minutes ago. And we can see that the sentiment is broadly in line with the wider market. So we have the rebound following the housing market reopening. And we're also seeing demand start to ease a little bit, although we are still 50% above the 2018-19 average across England. If we just look at that purple line there, we can see that London is running just behind, and that's really just the international market, which has effectively been closed down during COVID. Hopefully, as international travel resumes, we should start to see that share of international buyers return to the market, and we should start to see demand come back a little bit in London. Next slide, please. And this is just really a piece of research that we've been focusing on recently. So for those of you who don't know, we try to do monthly research on the new homes market, obviously using Zoopla's market leading data. And what we're looking at here is the distance from the site or a listing that buyers are willing to travel for their next home. on the left-hand side, we have London, and we can see that it's a very narrow market. So if we look at the resale market there, the first bar, 90% of demand falls from a 10-mile radius or less, and 70% roughly within 5 miles. If we skip to the next bar, we can see for the new build market, actually it's slightly wider. So it's about 80% of demand comes from that 10 miles, which means that 20% of buyer demand emanates from outside of that 10-mile catchment. It gets a bit more interesting when we look at Great Britain, excluding London, the gap widens. So for the resale market, we're looking at around 65% comes within that 10-mile catchment, which obviously means there's a 35% audience out there who come from beyond 10 miles. And then the new build, this actually shrinks again. So 55% of demand comes from 55% of demand comes from within 10 miles, but that leaves 45% of new home demand extending beyond 10-mile radius. So beyond the reach of billboards, letter drops, and the like. Next slide, please. And what we've done here is we've actually broken down those demand bar charts we were just looking at into number of beds. And on the left-hand side here, we have London again, and we can see at 12 o'clock, we have 1 beds, 3 o'clock, 2 beds, 6 o'clock, 3 beds, and then 9 o'clock, 4 beds. And the little dots represent basically the distance from the listing or the site that people are willing to move. And we can see that in London, as we saw on the previous bar chart, demand is very narrow. So it all falls within a 5-mile catchment. We can just see that London kind of 4 beds in London do drive a slightly larger catchment, but not by much. It's pretty self-contained. And again, what we can see as well is the resale market is even closer, even tighter. And what if we look on the right-hand side for Great Britain, excluding London, this is where it starts to get interesting. So again, demand, we know from the previous slide, was a bit wider, but we can actually start to see some differentiation between the actual different bed types. So 1, 2, and 3 beds, around 6 or 7 miles or so, kind of from the listing or the site. But when we cast our eye to the 4 beds, so the highlighted one there, we can see that we're actually kind of starting to get to 10 miles and beyond. And that's actually as well, if we look at the resale market there, I think it's around 40% different to the 40% different to the resale market. So we can really see that in terms of marketing, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't quite hack it. A plot-by-plot approach may be beneficial. Next slide, please. And what we've done here is we've taken listings and we're looking here by supply and demand. And we've segmented by the number of beds which are running along the top. And then we've got the price buckets as well running down the grid. And unsurprisingly, over 50% of new build supply are those 2 and 3 beds in that kind of 200 to 400K price bucket. Hopefully no surprises, obviously aligns with Help to Buy. I guess if you cast your eye to the bottom of the 4-bed column, this is where it starts to get really interesting. 33% of new supply over the last 6 months has been 4 beds, 5% for 5 beds. So that's a large number of larger properties coming to the market. There's definitely a shift in size that we've seen through our listings. And if we assume that all things are equal and proportionate, supply should broadly track demand. And broadly speaking, it does. So again, if we look at that 200 to 400K price band, we can see that 52% of supply equates to 60% of demand. What I'd like you to focus on, though, is that bottom right quadrant. So what you can see here is slightly more expensive 4 and 5 bed properties, about 15% of listings. But when we actually cast our eye over to the demand, the corresponding demand, it's only really around 7%. So we do have a supply and demand mismatch there. And again, this tracks back to the previous slide, and essentially this really just hammers home the importance of marketing and being able to tailor your campaigns so that you get the greatest amount of demand for your supply. Thank you. I think there's one more last slide, but yeah, it's just a summary. So yeah, as Grania said, just to reiterate, demand is definitely elevated for new homes, although it's above the long run average. Pandemic has shifted priorities of the home and space, and space is certainly a more key consideration now. And buyers, lastly, are willing to travel further to find those larger new homes, and affordability is the main driver. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Now, Chris from Space and Time. I thought it's really interesting, Rob, if you look at the insights from the residents that we were able to show and what they're really loving about their homes. It's really mirrored in where the demand is and where the price increases is. It'd be interesting to see from Chris's perspective if that links through into consumer behaviour as well. Chris, over to you.
Great stuff, thank you. So yeah, just like the rest of the panelists, Ash will be driving this today. Without a doubt, you know, I'm probably going to be talking for the next 10 to 12 minutes. I could probably do that for 10 to 12 days, but that's not going to be fun for anyone. You will hear me say, next slide, a fair bit. So apologies if I come across a bit Chris Whitty rather than Chris Jones, but I'm going to try and make it as streamlined as I possibly can. So, and the main focus for me, just to really cover it off, and I guess bring it into a kind of an orderly close really, is to follow on from some of those really interesting insights that Rob was sharing, and where he was alluding to how this might be able to influence your approach to reaching consumers, and how it might sort of potentially affect your marketing strategy. I really want to try and focus in on actually how this can present a real opportunity to capitalize on this behavioural change that we've seen in the market. So without further ado, if you could just do the next slide, please, Rob. Please, Ash, sorry. Lovely, thank you. So this slide won't be of any real surprise to anyone. This is taken from a data source that we use called TGI, Target Group Index, which is a national survey that goes out every quarter. And it's going to be quite important, as I allude to this towards the end, but just for a bit of context, you can see there that the split in terms of the product type that people actually live in across the UK. So real kind of weighting towards houses. Like I say, no massive surprise, but it's quite important context as we kind of walk through the content. So if you could just do the next slide, please, Ash, thank you. Great. So one of those sort of really useful tools that we use is looking at search behaviour, and naturally Google is our sort of first port of call with that, being about 86% of the search market in the UK. And what we've done here is just look at specifically for new apartments and new houses, what the increases and decreases look like throughout the last 12 months or so. And actually there's a few interesting insights that we can sort of pull out here. Now, clearly you can see that the green line showing houses does operate at a very different level to apartments, but you can also see quite a bit more volatility there. So, for instance, the first half of this calendar year in 2021, houses have proven to be very strong, but that wasn't necessarily the case towards the end of 2020. And actually, for a lot of last year, particularly the second half, despite COVID, you can actually see that there was quite a strong resilience in the market for people searching for new apartments. And although there has been a decline in 2021, I do think overall it shows that there is still quite a bit of stability there between the two product types. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Ash, we'll start to just look at how this change starts to translate in terms of buyer preferences. And this is an interesting study that was conducted recently, which looks at when people are looking to buy property, consumers are looking to buy property, what are their main preferences? And you can see here that prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic, the two that I want to draw your attention to there are the two on the far right-hand side. 87% list distance to a near city or town as a important or very important consideration for them when buying a property, and 86% categorised a garage or off-street parking. If you then just click onto the next slide, please, Ash, that will then just bring in where we are now, and you know the two kind of additions into that top five there. which we've read a lot about, obviously with the increased remote working, you can see that 88% actually list now that connectivity within their home as being a really, really important consideration, and also that kind of proximity to green space and outdoor space being near the home. And also just a bit of a nominal increase on the far left there, just in terms of people looking for a garden and outdoor space specifically, which does just show a bit of a percentage increase in terms of the likely people looking for a house over apartment. So those buyer preferences are absolutely clear to see from this year versus pre-pandemic. If we just go to the next slide, please, Ash. Great stuff. So then if we just bring that back into the search space, because I think, again, this is always just a really, really useful thing to look at. Well, you can see that people searching for houses with a garden, again, over that same 12-month period, you can see a marked increase. But I think it's really important to think about this in terms of, and I've talked about this at various stages before with clients and at previous events, is that trying to distinguish between a change and a trend, because actually the correlation here is that a lot of the upward trends that you see in people looking for outdoor space and likely houses with gardens is largely driven by emerging out of lockdowns. And the longer we spend out of lockdowns, you can then see that start to flatten down to more normal levels. So as we start to predict what this looks like in the future, I do think there is a rather large sample of salt to go with this, where we just have to really consider the long-term effects rather than just the acute effects. So at the moment, there is absolutely that trend towards people looking for that outdoor space, but how long that goes on for, I would speculate, is up for debate. If we just go to the next slide, please. This is quite an interesting one. I hadn't come across this term before I put this presentation together, but there is such a thing as a shoffice nowadays. Now that's a combination of a shed and an office. Now to me that looks like quite a nice shed, but you can see that on the right hand side, sales of that kind of outdoor space have increased exponentially as a result of COVID. And even if you look at what happened in May in terms of consumers working from home, there was a significant amount of people still working from home. And I think there's an interesting thing to think about. And there was an article in the Telegraph actually that I read the other day that was talking about what really will start to influence this is ultimately what happens to the remote working model, because with the increase that we're seeing in infections, that's likely to have a knock-on effect to the number of people working from home and for how long, and obviously the appetite for this kind of thing. But if that were to reverse the other way and employers take control of this slightly further as infection rates drop, that will have a marked difference in terms of where consumer demand is going. If we just go to the next slide, please, Ash. Great stuff. And this is just as we start to draw to a close on some of the insights. This is our space and time on new homes index. So across our pool of UK developer clients, this just allows us to have a very broad understanding of what the new homes industry is doing. And you can start to see that actually not just search behaviour, but actual on-site behaviour, what is going on here. And you can see that pre and post pandemic, there is a marked difference in consumers looking more for houses and engaging more with houses than apartments. Although overall, again, supporting what Rob and Granny were talking about earlier, is that there is still overall an increase irrespective of what product we're talking about versus pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please, Ash. Thank you. Great. So final few slides, I guess, just to really get to the crux of what I think we want to try and take away from this. Well, first of all, on the left-hand side there, a bit of a snippet from Experian, looking at, although there has been an overall kind of rise in property prices as a result of this, of various things, whether it's stamp duty changes, just increase in demand, lower interest rates, etc. That has meant that buyer profiles for first-time buyers particularly, i.e. more than likely apartments, has changed. And actually, if we then draw that into the example of that slide that I showed right at the very beginning, and looking at those that are currently living in those product types, and you pull out what are called mosaic profiles, which are broad personas within Experian's data pool, they categorize them within these mosaic profiles, and you can see very, very clear differences between a typical UK house buyer and a typical UK apartment buyer. So it's really, really key. And again, just to support a point Rob made earlier, you know, there is not a one size fits all strategy here. It has to be dynamic, and it has to be targeted to the product. Just go to the next slide, please, Ash. Thank you. So then just to give you an example there, picking out those two leading audience groups across the products, clear noticeable differences. And if you had a one size fits all strategy, then naturally you're not going to be seeing the results on one particular product. You're actually just going to be creating a bit of a blocker for both product types. So it's really, really important that this kind of level of product and audience segmentation is going on, so that you're really kind of understanding what those audience groups are and how to influence them. And an example of that is, if you just go to the next slide, please, Ash. Lovely. So just day to day, again, those that will be familiar with Space and Time and what we do, this is something that very much is our bread and butter in terms of choosing, you know, working out your media strategy and your media positioning. And this just gives you an idea when, indicatively, if we were looking at those two audience groups, you can see very, very clear differences about their preferences, how they, what they engage with, how we should be influencing them. And actually that just really supports that notion that there isn't a one size fits all strategy here. Next slide, please, Ash. Thank you. Great. And I think one of the really key things here is, as we've really focused on that, that consumer at the heart of everything that we do, and really thinking about product segmentation, audience segmentation, something that we really, really endorse at Space and Time is all about doing this real time and being able to create actionable change very, very quickly. You know, the best model here is to be looking at customer data in real time and making it actionable, which ultimately is what this is about. Understand the consumer, and you will understand how best to influence them and maximize the productivity, irrespective of what products you're selling. So finally, just the key takeaways. If you could just go to the final slide, please, Ash. Thank you. So just the things I wanted to cover, the stuff I was just alluding to in terms of what you need to do, analysing your data, how you make it actionable. At Space and Time, we're absolutely seeing marked differences in the work that we're doing with clients. So that absolutely is a trend in the industry. And then just those three kind of points. Well, first of all, what do you need to do? Well, understand the audience is the first thing. If you can understand how to engage with them, how to reach them, that's going to be a really, really important advantage for you when thinking about your marketing and your comm strategy. Seeing this data and making it actionable will ultimately allow you to tailor what you do and target effectively so that you can maximize the response from it. And also measuring and giving yourself the ability to be able to respond to it quickly and tailor the first two segments here are absolutely what I'd suggest taking away from this. And ultimately, in doing so, that just means that irrespective of what product you have, it's right audience, right time, right place. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris and Rob and Gronya, for some really insightful and incredibly detailed presentations. I think we for the audience, we didn't write those presentations in tandem. We put them together yesterday, and it was, fascinating to see that there is, thread through all of them on the theme of the appreciation of houses and what people appreciate about them. And obviously, with the HomeViews data, we're able to really quantify that from existing residents. I think there's a few things that came out of all of that data for me. Firstly, the lack of supply. Well, if people are loving living in their houses, they're not going to put them on the market, I guess. So there's a constriction of people selling in the open market, and that coupled with higher demand, is pushing those prices up, which is really interesting to see. And something that Chris, and it may be counterintuitive. I think a lot of people might think that the property market right now, because of lockdown, is a difficult place to be, but regionally as well, seeing those house price increases. And Chris, what I found really interesting, lockdown 3, that first half of 2021, that massive spike in house searches. And I think everyone, I know I did with 2 young children, got to a point of, I need more space. And particularly through January, February, March. And that kind of leads me on to my first question. By the way, everyone, we've had some brilliant questions come through, and I will get to them. But my first question, if looking at the pricing, demand and consumer searches, obviously houses are flavour of the month, well, not of the month, of the year. Do we see, was this trend happening before COVID? You know, a lot of people talk about the high street dying a death. Well, that was already happening and COVID had just sped that up. Was this a trend that was already happening? Do we foresee it carrying on? Gronya, what's your view on that?
Well, when we look at the kind of end product, which is pricing, gives us a good idea of what was happening in the market. And house prices, that's for houses, was up about 1.9% in the year to June last year. Flats were up about 1.4%. In the year since then, we can see prices for houses are up 7% or more, and the prices for flats are still growing at 1.4%. So you really feel it's a pandemic trend for this search for space, more inside space, more outdoor space. I do agree with Chris. We're not in a state where we've had a big shift and it's going to stay that way. People have made a decision to move house. I mean, they'll be looking into the medium term. You don't get a mortgage and move and uproot your family to do a short-term move usually. So people will have looked through what's going on for them work-wise and family-wise and wanting to be in a different location. There is definitely some of that still to come. More offices are now, for those office-based workers, more offices are confirming what the next year or the next 2 years are going to look like. So I definitely think there's more of that trend to come. However, in the rental market, which is the quickest market to react to whatever's going on, we can see that there's a building demand now for apartments in city centres, which have been affected by COVID. So you would expect that the sales market will start to follow suit. And in London, particularly, international market, when you have that global travel back, you would expect to see that demand start to build again in the centre of town.
Thanks, Gronya. Chris, what's your view on search behaviour and whether or not we'll see this staying the same or levelling off?
Yeah, well, I think as sort of Gronya said there, there were definitely trends that were active prior to COVID, irrespective. And I think if anything, a lot of what came out of COVID was an accelerating effect as opposed to a complete pivot in a different direction. If you were to single out apartments specifically, there were some underlying things at play way before COVID. Whether that was the cladding issues that were happening or the issues around leaseholds. There was negative press in that in the space, and that was stabilizing prices. But you did also see that in the chart I showed earlier in terms of search demand, it is still a relatively resilient market. There are less fluctuations in the market, and although certainly this year there has been a slight decline in interest in specifically apartments, I think overall it's unlikely to stay that way, and it's likely to stabilize into that position that it's been in for a kind of really long period of time. And I kind of alluded to it at the end that I think a lot of this is dependent on what happens with places of work and how that shifts. Because if there is a sanction to be in a city centre to work for a period of time, then that will have to change people's buying decisions and moving decisions. And also, I think you saw on one of the other slides I was showing in terms of the buyer preferences, you can see that year on year how quickly those preferences can change. And there's it's very conceivable that next year or the year after that, there could be emerging trends around, well, actually, I quite like the idea of being connected, and I quite like the idea of being close to a station, and I quite like the idea of socializing, and those things could start to emerge and shift the paradigm again. So I personally think that there's a lot of long-term underlying things that were in play anyway, and will likely default for the most part back to those.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. I think what was fascinating about our review data, looking at it over lockdown, is reviews from residents in apartment buildings really appreciated the sense of community and coming together within them. And that a lot of that was actually down to the management teams that successfully pulled that together and reacted to COVID proactively. It was a nightmare across the industry, for everyone to manage to keep people safe, but particularly in high density apartment schemes. I think residents felt that management teams in apartment buildings went above and beyond to try and do that. In a lot of cases, it had a great impact. I also think, you know, we can see from our data that there are some key points to bring through if you are marketing an apartment development that is important to resonate with people, to make them realize, to pull them back in. I mean, really what we're talking about is city living and country living, you know, but around housing types. And I totally agree with you, Chris. We've already seen, we're conducting a number of surveys and review acquisition processes in London and cities across. And that feeling of, oh, you know, I've got my city back and this is opening up, I really do feel that's going to feed in to everyone's psyche. We'll see that shift. I've got a number of questions, so I'm gonna take a few here. We have a question from Gary Newman. This is directed for me. How many reviews made up the top 10? So obviously I mentioned how many one of those developments had to have to get into the top 10. It was a minimum of 20 verified reviews. And the answer, Gary, is there were 266 reviews spread across the housing developments, and there were 389 reviews spread across the apartment developments. I hope that answers your question. Chris, a question for you from Edward Morton Jack. Hi, Ed. In the first slide, 78 to 22% house flat split. Is that per property or is that per person in the UK? You're on mute, Chris. Someone had to do it.
Rookie error. There we go. Back in. Yeah. So really good observation there. It's so that's by property. That's done on. So when the survey's sent out, that's purely done by property by 2,000 respondents that take part.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Ed, I hope that answered your question. We have a question from Anthony, all the way from Australia. We really do have an international audience. God, what time is it in Australia now? That's very dedicated to be on the call. Perhaps one for Gráinne and Rob. In Australia and Sydney, Melbourne still feature in the top 5 unaffordable cities in the world, and the markets remain strong despite lockdowns. What's your predictions regarding housing affordability in the UK for the next 3 years?
We've already seen that in the data. So the affordability rates have actually stayed relatively steady because we are actually seeing earnings growth at the same time in the UK, and we look at household income. Now, we know that earnings growth can rise even while some people are maybe losing their jobs due to furlough, because it only really recognises people who are in work. So that means the total affordability rates are staying relatively steady, and we would expect that to continue. But as I highlighted in the presentation, it's the more affordable markets that are seeing the highest level of growth. But because wages are rising in line with that, the actual affordability rates are staying relatively steady. Can I cheat slightly and go back to our initial point as well in the previous question about houses? I would just say that we did have a stamp duty holiday during the whole of the last 12 months, and people could make bigger savings on bigger purchases. You know, you could make up to £15,000 savings, up to 500,000. Typically, housing stock around the country houses rather than flats in some of the regions. So that may also have pushed more demand into those larger houses where people could make bigger savings. And we're starting to see that ease off. But again, we would say that that demand for housing is likely to got more to play out through the rest of the year.
Thanks, Gráinne. Interesting question from Laura Sears. Are master planners going to have to consider density further as a quest for space continues? And how can they find the balance between this and the return of investment for developers? Well, I think I've got a kind of point of view on this. In a lot of those top 10 developments we saw, particularly the apartment-led developments, Kidbrooke Village springs to mind as a great example of a large regeneration placemaking scheme. And obviously in a lot of all the top rated housing developments, it was mentioned that there was that space to breathe, that room to park. And actually one of the reasons why people rated housing developments poorly was the increased density. So this is a really good point. I think this is about master planning, but it's also about apartment planning, right? Everyone has, I think that one thing we've seen anecdotally with our partners who have studio apartments and one-bed apartments is that people who were in a studio are desperately looking to get into a one-bed. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn to improve the layout of apartments to accommodate home working, obviously, but also, that there is a move for a lot of apartment providers to provide co-working spaces. But if you are working from home, somewhere where you're not just shut up in your flat, and that will have an impact on the actual design of the units. In terms of master planning and placemaking, I think that integration of green space clearly adds value. And from an ROI perspective, if 2 or 3 less houses means that there's a premium you can charge on the remaining ones, I think that's very clear. From our data, Laura, it's very, very clear that there is a return on investment. I also think it's about differentiation. It's not purely about pricing. Where there is more supply, where there is intense competition, if you are that developer offering that extra space and that access to green space, it clearly has such a massive effect on the residents. Anyone else have a point of view on that?
No, well, the only thing I'd add to it, Rory, to be honest, is I think planning regulations will support that as well in the future. I think there'll be changes to the obligations of a developer when putting a development together. A lot of that framework was in place, for the last few years, but I think there'll probably be extra areas put into planning regulations to kind of really encourage developers to invest in that, because it's going to be a significant part of what consumers are going to be expecting in the future. I think it's a good question, Laura.
One other question, rather selfishly, probably more directed at us, but for Chris, how do you think consumer feedback, consumer reviews can influence consumer behaviour and decision making? Are we moving into an age where this level of transparency is just a given and it's needed? What's your view on that?
So this is a really interesting one, and again, I mentioned I could be here for 10 to 12 days earlier. I could probably be here for 10 to 12 days specifically for this question, but I would say that there was a really interesting piece of research that was done by Google fairly recently, probably in the last 2 or 3 months, and I spoke about this in an HBC webinar a few months ago, and this really sort of looked at the fact that, in the digital space and in the online space, there are so many touch points now for people investigating products, working out whether there are any discounts, whether it's the right one or not. And one of the really critical things to be able to distinguish yourself from what Google terms the messy middle, which is that kind of period of, do I buy it, don't I buy it, how does it compare, is what they call social bias. And social bias is using reviews to influence purchase, because so many people now prioritize what others are saying about a product before making that purchase. And the same thing can be said in the e-commerce space and the FMCG space. If you look at something like Amazon and Google reviews, the value that people place on those reviews before purchasing a product, it's exactly the same thing here. So where your real challenge as a marketeer, potentially, or as a developer, to break through the noise and to make yourself different and to convert someone from someone that might be interested to someone that genuinely is interested in buying. A lot of the time, that social bias and leveraging the positive response around your products from the consumers themselves is one of the really, really important ways that you can break through that. And obviously, you guys at HomeViews are pioneering that. So that's what I think needs to happen.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I obviously agree with everything you just said, but I would also add to that. I think that it's not just about getting 5-star reviews. The act of asking your residents to write reviews, promoting transparency, there's a huge pressure from government level and the consumer just to promote transparency and learn from feedback that maybe isn't always 100% positive. We always say a poor review responded to quickly and really well is worth 5-star reviews, and I think that's we truly believe in that. It is 1 o'clock. We packed a lot into that hour. I just want to say a massive thank you to the panel, Gonya, Rob and Chris. Thank you so much for your time and insight, and to everyone that attended HomeView's first ever webinar that we've hosted. This will be one in a series, so please look out. There'll be some more planned over the summer. If we didn't answer your question, I will make sure we come back to you and answer your questions over the next day or so. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the week and enjoy the weather. Bye-bye.